Bank of America's latest consumer checkpoint shows total card spending per household in April rose 1% from the year prior, a big rise from 0.3% in March. The bank attributing the gain to an early Easter, seasonal factors, and tax refunds. For more on this, we turn to David Tinsley, who is the Bank of America Institute senior economist here. David, great to have you on the program with us. First and foremost, just walk us through the top takeaway here and what you're seeing in card spending per household and what's really the catalyst there.
Thanks for having me on, Brad. Yeah, I think our mantra at the Institute for a while now has been that the consumer spending momentum is soft but stable. And when we look at our 69 million customers and sort of past their credit and debit card spending, we get the numbers you referred to there. So spending in April up about 1% year on year, actually looking a little bit better than March. But the truth be told, the data's been pretty choppy over the last few months due to calendar effects, Easter, leap year, etc. Looking through that, I think the story is continued spending momentum, not particularly accelerating or decelerating to any great extent. And I think within that story, and this is really interesting because there's been a lot of kind of corporate and market chatter around the low-end consumer. What we're seeing in our data is that the low-income consumer is still spending. In fact, their spending growth is faster than the higher income consumer. So that's a pretty good news story, I think.
Why do you think that is? Take us further into that data point, because I was looking at some of the charts here, one of the exhibits showing that lower income card spending growth stronger than that of both middle and higher income consumers as of April, as you were just mentioning. What's really driving that?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's a labour market story. The consumer always comes back to the labour market. And when we look at our data at the lower end of the income distribution, wages and salaries, which we can see by the money going into people's bank accounts, if you like, is up 4% year on year. And at the higher end, there has been some acceleration, actually, but growth there's around 1%. So what's going on there? Well, the labour market has been very beneficial to the lower end over the last few years. You kind of had that reopening story after the pandemic, lots of jobs in leisure and hospitality, also in healthcare. Still, there's momentum there. Obviously, we have to watch the data really carefully from here to see whether that slightly softer payrolls report last week, whether that keeps going in terms of, developing in the data. But near term, the outlook is pretty solid, I think, for the low end. And just one other thing I think is worth noting, that when you look at the savings, the cash in people's bank accounts relative to pre-pandemic times is still well up. So, and that's true across all income cohorts. Right now, due to the tax refund season, it's up about 70% almost at the lower income end of the distribution. So, that gives a little bit of wind in the sails for consumers receiving those receiving those refunds too.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's one thing to have the savings that you use that refund to build up. It's another thing as well to really reduce debt and look at it as a mechanism to cut into where you owe, and lower income consumers using those tax refunds to reduce debt. Another core point within this report, I wonder where else you're seeing spending driven by some of the tax refunds right now.
Yeah, so when we look at the tax refunds going into accounts, and we look at the period just before, the 3 weeks before and the 3 weeks after, we can kind of track the boost to spending. And you do see the spending increasing in clothing and consumer durables, actually, which is pretty interesting because usually speaking, the consumer story is around this pivot to services over the last year or so. Services did increase as well. There was some spending there. And then, as I was saying, the deposits rose somewhat. So in other words, people, at least for now, have banked some of the cash. And as you were saying there, what's interesting, and perhaps a note of caution, is that the lower end of the income distribution, the lower income consumers, they paid some debt down, more so than the middle and the higher end. So in other words, they paid debt down. What debt? Student debt, it seems, and credit card debt. So, sensible, prudent actions, but perhaps also a little sign of caution on the part of the lower income consumer as well.
You know, it's interesting. Caution seems like it's going to be a word that contributes to some of the moderation we might see in spending. And I think back to the data that just came out this morning from the University of Michigan and the Consumer Sentiment Index showing that consumers had been reserving judgment for the past few months, but now they perceive negative developments on a number of dimensions, whether that be inflation, unemployment, interest rates, potentially all moving in an unfavorable direction in the year ahead. I wonder how you're evaluating that as well and what type of moderation you would expect as a result.
You know, that's an interesting point. So consumers, despite the economy in pretty good shape, really, and the labour market's in good shape, we're seeing the spending growth. They've been pretty pessimistic for quite a long period of time. And I think first and foremost, that's been an inflation story. So, you know, even now, although price inflation, although the rate of inflation has come down, you go and buy a coffee or something like that, the price is well up from where it was pre-pandemic. And I think that still weighs on confidence. And I guess people have seen the inflation rate come down, but they're still seeing those price increases. And the other thing, I guess, that's going on right now is, you know, the Fed's situation, the narrative around the Fed has changed from near-term cuts to higher for longer, you know, maybe a cut at the end of this year, perhaps, as a B of A global researcher forecasting. So I guess the consumer is also perhaps a little bit hesitant, a little bit downbeat on that outlook as well. So there certainly are things weighing on sentiment there.
It's really hard to keep the midpoint of my coffee purchases, David, at about $3.25 at this point right now. Sometimes I splurge and I go to the $7 coffee manufacturer out there.
Right.
We all know them well. But at the end of the day, a lot of decisions, micro decisions that add up to macro results, hopefully, for consumers. David Tinsley, thanks so much for taking the time here this morning.
Thanks so much.